Thanks, Katelyn. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It got super duper nice outside in about the last 3 hours, so we appreciate you taking your time to come and sit down with us instead of frolicking out in the sunshine. So at least in Western New York, it's really nice. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started here in a jiffy. All right. Going to go ahead and make that a big presentation. Katelyn, does that look proper, or do I need to switch?
We're seeing presenter screen right now.
Oh, I can't hear you. Yes?
No.
No. Okay. Let's go ahead and switch that. Better?
Yes.
Great. All right. So tonight's seminar is Backyard Beef, and it is a partnership between Cornell Cooperative Extension, so Katelyn Walley-Stoll and myself being their representatives tonight, and Small Farms Veterans Project FarmOps. We really appreciate FarmOps contributions to helping us put together this programming for all of you. We have some really exciting programming coming up, and without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. So thank you so much. So my name is Amy Barkley. I am the Livestock and Beginning Farm Specialist with the Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops Program. Katelyn Walley-Stoll is here running tech backup tonight for us. She is our Farm Business Management Specialist from the same team. We cover a 5-county region in southwestern New York, so Erie, Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, Allegany, and Steuben counties. And we're a partnership between Cornell University and these 5 counties. This is our team. We have a 4-person team. Besides Farm Business Management and Livestock and Beginning Farms, we also cover field crops and forages and dairy production. This is us. Hello. We don't have candy today, but we appreciate you being here. Our contact information is up here, so if you have any trouble at all, or if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Our little disclaimer before we get into the meat and potatoes of this, the information that we present is always for informational purposes. We do our best to research the most accurate and up-to-date information, but it is not, in this case, we're going to talk about a lot of animal health things. So this is not a replacement for sound veterinary counsel, but it's a good place to start getting ideas. I am not a veterinarian. I'm an animal scientist, but I don't have medical training. So with that said, if you have any tech issues as we go along here, you can go ahead and call or text. Katelyn's phone number is listed first. Mine's listed on the bottom. Just go ahead and shoot us a message, and we'll be more than happy to help you out. The schedule upcoming, we want to share this with you. Katelyn did share in the chat box the registration link to Minding Your Marketing P's and Q's. This will be tomorrow from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. There's a little tiny URL where you can register. And then our next livestock program that is scheduled is Raising Poultry for Meat, where we're going to review basically how to raise meat birds with the intention of either processing them for your freezer or processing and selling them. And then also coming down the pike are raising goats, protecting against Murphy's Law, which is how to diversify your farm, and processing meat chickens, where we'll have several video recordings of us actually processing chickens and going through that process with you. Now, the regularly scheduled program of Backyard Beef. First, we're going to go ahead and start with a poll. And the question is, oh, Katelyn, did you just run that for me? You're awesome. Have you raised beef cattle before? So your options are, yep, I've been raising them for years. Yeah, but this is my first time. Not yet, but I'm thinking about it. And nope, and I'm not sure why I'm here. We'll give that a couple of minutes, well, a couple of seconds, sorry. A couple of minutes would be redundant. Okay. All right, so it looks like we're a pretty split group of folks. We've got some people that have been raising them for years, so hopefully this isn't too much of a redundant introductory class for you, and hopefully you can pull something great out of this to take back to your operation. For those first timers and not yet but thinking about it, so I think this is a really good place to start. This is a 30,000-foot overview of raising beef in your backyard. It is not meant to be super in-depth. There are opportunities for us to create more videos about beef production that are further in depth. So if there's something specific you want to learn about, let us know, and we will work with FarmOps to see if we can develop a class on that. Okay, so I want to ask you, what do you want to learn today? So you'll go ahead and use your chat feature to share one thing. I'd like everybody to share one that you hope to take with you after today's class. If it's something that I don't cover in the presentation, we'll make sure that we answer it in after the presentation so that we can get your question answered. I'm just gonna let us think about that for about 15 more seconds. Some of us are using the Q&A, that's perfect too. All right, so as you're finishing typing that up, we're going to throw up a second poll. And this poll is, why are you here? So why are you thinking about or are raising your own beef cattle? Your options are to know where your food comes from, to be more self-sufficient, to make sure that you have enough meat for your family, to save money, and because you enjoy raising cattle. You can go ahead and choose multiple options, or if you just have one in mind, you can go ahead and just choose one too. Awesome. I get to see the results before you do, so. So it looks like we have a really good diversification of reasons why we are raising beef cattle. Most of us want to achieve all of these boxes, so thank you for sharing that. All right. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning and let's talk cattle breeds very, very briefly. Generally, it's a game of pick a breed, any breed. You might have a preference for belted cattle. You may have a preference for black cattle. You may have a preference for white cattle. You may have a preference for short or tall or muscular or dairy type. And all of those are great. All of those will produce a decent amount of meat. They're a good meat animal. And so I don't think that there's a huge preference for breed out here, or a huge advantage to choosing a specific breed. And that said, some of these breeds have different characteristics. So looking at this is a table of breed crosses grouped by type. Not all of the breeds are listed at the left-hand column, but this is just a general overview of the groups that these cattle fall in. So as we travel down this sheet, what we see is that growth size, growth rate, mature size, all of those increase as you go down. So your big Lunken football players are at the bottom with your Limousine and Charolais cattle, and cattle that are, a little lighter on their feet, a little bit smaller bodied, they're going to be more along the top of the chart. So your Hereford, Angus, Devon, that sort of thing. If you cross breeds like this, you can also result in genetics that are somewhere in the middle. And there are also breeds that are somewhere in the middle, like Brangus, which is a Brahma Angus cross, maybe a Holstein Angus cross, things like that. Okay, so the British breeds, I've listed some of the very familiar ones here, ones that I've seen in New York State. British breeds tend to be good mothers. They tend to produce a good amount of milk. They're generally on the smaller side. So if you don't want a super intimidating animal, maybe choosing a smaller mature sized animal is the right choice for you. They also tend to finish a little faster than the larger framed animals. Light muscling in general, not always. Slower growing, not always, but sometimes, but they have good marbling. And so breeds will include Highlands, Angus, belted Galloways. We're looking in the dairy side, Ayrshire, Shorthorns, which are dual purpose breed, Devons, Guernseys, Jerseys, that sort of thing. Now, when we go to the other type of breeds, we have what are called continental breeds. These were breeds that were developed in a separate part of the world from the English breeds. And these have good parental instincts, similar along lines of good mothering instincts. They've got good growth rate, larger mature size, so they take a little longer to finish out, but there's a little more meat there at the end. and they're a little heavier muscled. So these include breeds like Limousine, Charolais, Longhorn, and Simmental. There are also other breeds, mixed beef breeds, which I touched on very quickly. And what's coming to the forefront more and more as we see dairy farms working to diversify are beef on dairy calves. So these are calves that are produced by inseminating a female dairy cow with beef semen. These crosses come out, they have some characteristics of beef, some characteristics of dairy. They might be more beefy, they might be more dairy-like. It just depends on what cross you get. But they are readily available, especially in auctions and if your calf source is a dairy farm. You can also raise pure dairy calves, and pure dairy calves are fine meat animals. They just grow slower, and they need a little bit higher nutrition to achieve the same gains per day as beef type breeds. And before I go any more, I want to share that I am okay with being interrupted at any time during this presentation. So if there's a question that pops up in the chat that is unrelated to the original question I asked in the beginning, where I said ask your questions that you want answered, please go ahead and pop that in the chat or the Q&A, and Katelyn will read those out to me and I'll go ahead and answer those.
We're all good for now. So we've just got the first.
You.
On my dummy one, if everybody else, can anyone else hear me? Or
yep.
Nina, if you want to.
We can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. I don't know what it was doing then. Anyway, that's okay. I was just gonna say that there's no other questions so far, so I will interrupt you if we see them come in. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Katelyn. All right, so the question sometimes comes down to where do I get my beef cattle? And I want to share that before I get into this a little bit more. This whole perspective is not from the keeping a mama cow and breeding her and having babies. This is not a cow-calf operation conversation. This is more of a conversation of I want to raise some beef. I want to be more self-sufficient. I'm going to get a calf that's already, either freshly born or maybe grown a little bit, and I want to finish it out, on my property. So with that in mind, there are a few places where you can get these, what we call terminal animals. So animals that are bred with the intention of being processed by the person that buys them. So if you have the opportunity, if you have the connection with somebody that you know and trust who raises beef cattle and raises them in a way that you agree with and raises breeds that you're interested in, I would say that's probably the best place to buy a beef animal. So long as it falls within your price range and all that other stuff. Just because you know where that animal's coming from, you might know the breeding background, and you'll probably understand and get a good feel for the disease status and growth rate of those animals on that farm. If you don't know somebody with beef cattle or calves that you can raise out, a registered breeder is also a pretty good guess, especially if you want a purebred animal. You can also answer a public posting. Some people post on boards in the local farm supply store that they have feeder calves available. Feeder calves are calves that are raised to a certain poundage and then sold. So they're typically weaned at that point. Sometimes you'll see them in the Penny Saver, on Facebook, on Craigslist. And this is, a couple people removed from your inner circle, right? So I think that there's good animals out there. I also think that there aren't great animals out there. And so by answering these advertisements, at least you can talk to the person who's raising the animal and feel if they're a good fit for you. The last option, which is a valid option, but carries the most risk, is purchasing from an auction barn. So an auction barn looks kind of like the picture on the right-hand side, where they run cattle into the ring and then you can bid on it price per pound, and then they'll sell you the animal. You don't necessarily know the background of those animals. You know a weight, you know an approximate breed based on how the animal looks, and you know an approximate age based on the size of the cow. But not much more than that. They may come with vaccine statuses that may be read out by the caller in the ring, the auctioneer, but it's hit and miss. So if you want to go this way, I think it's perfectly valid, but just know it carries more risk. So let's talk typical ages and weights. So if you're buying cattle with the intent of finishing them, you have a couple of options. You can start with a green calf. So a calf that has been born, put on the truck, carried to the auction barn, dropped off, Or it's a calf where it was born last night, your neighbor calls you and says, hey, I've got a bucket calf for you or a bottle calf for you. You go pick it up, take it home. Those calves typically are highest risk simply because there's a lot of stress that they're undergoing, changing environments in that first 7 days. But those calves can sometimes be fed colostrum and given vaccinations and treated really well, such that when they get to your farm, there's not a huge risk of that animal not doing well. Started calves are a little bit of a better bet. They're about 7 days or so old. I'm making generalizations and timelines here. I know that there's a huge range, but I'm going to say for this conversation, started calves are about a week, maybe 2 weeks old. They are used to a bucket at that point. They typically have good antibody development. You know at that point whether or not they've got some sort of disease in their system that has entered their body from the birthing environment. So they're a choice. Then you end up with 250-pound calves. These are probably the lightest calves that you'll typically see run through an auction ring. These are calves that have been weaned off the bucket at about 9 weeks, and they will go up for sale. Then you have your 500 to 700 pounders. They're about 6 to 9 months old, and a 900-pound calf is about 12 months old. And then, of course, once that animal gets to maturity, they're going to weigh about 1,200 pounds. If they're a larger frame-sized animal, they may fill out around 1,400, even 1,450 pounds. Oh, and I have the age at finishing at 14 to 30 months. 14 months is probably, you could probably get away with 12 months if you are okay with a smaller animal, but typically producers raise them to about 14 months, up to 30 months if those animals are being grass-fed. They just take longer to mature.
I just wanted to
Friendly
add.
neighborhood, Katelyn.
Yes.
Well, I can't hear yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, it takes like 5 seconds to kick in.
Interesting. That's okay. I'll just awkwardly pause. So Nina commented in that if you're deciding to buy from somebody that's outside of your inner circle, people that you know, ask to visit the farm directly to look at the operation. And I just commented back, yes, that's an excellent idea. You can get a sense, right? Like when you're walking onto a farm, are things picked up? Do the animals look healthy? Do they have records? You're going to know if that farm is a reputable farm that you can buy from, even if they're new to you. Mm-hmm. My other suggestion that I included in the chat was that, especially if beef is new to you, get a farmer friend to go with you that is familiar with beef cows, because they're going to be able to pick up on some things that you might not notice. And then you have another person with you too, which is always just helpful to have. So the other thing that I would recommend too is to just, when you're visiting that farm, like ask ahead for records. So the farm should know when that calf was born, if they've got vaccinated for anything, if they've been tested for anything.
If they've been castrated.
Exactly. And just if farms have records, that means that they're managing them. And when farms don't have records, it's the question of like, okay, how stand up of an operation are you? So thank you, Nina, for pointing out, like, definitely a site visit is a good first step.
Yep. Excellent. All right. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on green calves, because green calves are a bargain at the sale barn, or a bargain off your farmer neighbor. These are calves that have just been born. This calf, I could tell, has been born within the day or within a couple of days, because if you look at its navel or its little belly button, it's got flesh hanging off of it where it was attached to mom. And so that calf obviously is very young. So if you're looking for started calves, which are, a little older, a little less risk, they'll typically, this umbilical cord is essentially what it is. It will be totally dried up. It may or may not have fallen off. The calves should be able to stand on their own. They should look healthy. They should have clear eyes, no diarrhea. And if you stick your fingers in their mouth, they should suck on them. They might get angry and not suck on them and run away, but they should if they're good, healthy, robust calves. Compensatory gain is one of those really interesting things that the commercial beef industry takes advantage of, that I also think that we can take advantage of as raisers of small herds of beef cattle. Compensatory gain is essentially where an animal is held back growth-wise. That's usually because of nutritional deficits. And when they get to their finishing facility, they're going to grow better than a calf that's really fat and healthy and then gets transferred. It's just kind of how biology works. They need to do a little bit of catching up if they're on the skinny side. So just make sure that they're not sickly looking cattle. We'll talk about diseases of cattle to look out for in a little bit. But just, good looking calves, but on the skinny side. So my question is, and you can pop the answers in the chat, which of the two calves on the right-hand side of this screen will gain better? Is it the calf on top or the calf on the bottom? Assume they're the same age and assume they're about the same breeding genetics. And you can pop those answers into the chat. And I'll go ahead and take a peek at those. Okay, so we have a lot of answers here for bottom, and it's kind of a trick question because the calf that's going to gain better is the skinnier calf at the top. So the calf at the bottom is fat and roly-poly and happy. Not saying that the calf up top isn't happy, but the calf up top has a little less muscle, a little less fat, and will benefit from a good quality feed put to it when it gets to your place. Okay. So we're going to talk about some housing considerations for beef cattle on the small scale. These photos have been contributed by Dr. Mike Baker. He's an emeritus professor here at Cornell, and he has some really good pictures that I don't, so I took them. A lot of times when we start out in a livestock operation, we want to have the perfect barn. We want to have the perfect pasture. We want to have the perfect looking animals and the perfect management. But the reality is working with what you've got is going to make it a more sustainable enterprise for you. And it's going to make, it's going to take advantage of resources that you already have so that you're not stressing out about having to put together a facility just for the cattle. So we're going to talk about some things that the cattle need, and we're not going to talk about necessarily this picture perfect barn because that's not the reality for most of us. The minimum housing requirements for beef cattle is that they have a windbreak. I've seen cattle out in pasture in the winter with just a line of trees and bushes for a windbreak. Not ideal, but it's fine. They need a place to get out of the mud and snow. You need to limit the amount of mud that is in their holding pasture, especially sacrifice areas, which are areas where cattle are allowed to roam in winter so that they don't chew up the pasture with their hoofs. There should be good airflow through a facility if you decide to put them in a facility, which I do recommend having a roof over their heads. And ideally you want dry-ish, it could be composted or composting, but dry deep bedding material, it's not required, but it will help animal gains, especially during the winter, and will lead to better animal health outcomes in general. So this is what I mean by approximately dry. Like this ticks all the boxes, right? So this is a coverall barn. Most of us don't even have a coverall barn, but this just shows the basics. So it's open on multiple sides, but the animals can get out of the wind. There's a windbreak on the right. That's probably the west side where wind is coming through. This hoop barn allows for really good ventilation. It provides cover over the animals, protection from wind and snow, and the bedding inside, there's some hay or straw that's been kicked around here, but underneath is a composted bedded pack. And those animals look clean. Those animals look healthy. This is perfect. This can also be perfect. So this has everything that's the exact same as that hoop barn. You might not be able to take animals out to full size here just simply because this looks like a modified calf hutch or like a group calf hutch, but it's a good place to start if this is what you have. This is also fine. This looks like a three-sided structure that was put together with materials that this farmer had on hand. You can see that there are full logs that have been debarked and the cattle look happy. They're sitting down, they're straw, they're dry. And it looks like it's wintertime outside. So all in all, this is great. Okay, so we're going to talk really quickly about pasture access and fencing. I'm going to start with this slide and I'm going to go back. So the question is to pasture or not to pasture. We don't need to pasture cattle. We can, and we can take advantage of some of that free forage and free manure spreading that happens when cattle are out on pasture. But to raise cattle to full maturity, for beefers, you don't have to have it. As long as you have all of the requirements that we just shared and you're feeding them a full ration that meets their nutritional needs, they're going to grow for you. If you're putting cattle on pasture and you expect them to get their full nutrition from that pasture, you're going to need about 2 acres of excellent quality pasture per animal. And when I say excellent quality, I mean pasture that is not spotty, that comes back fast, that's not super weedy, that has species that the cattle will eat. They'll eat dandelion, by the way. I see dandelions popping, so that came to mind. But if it's a pasture that's subpar, you may need 4 acres per animal. So just something to think about. One beef animal is going to eat a lot of forage, depending on your management style. If you're taking, just say you're buying in an older animal, maybe let's say a 500-pound animal, you're taking it out to 1,200 pounds over 18 months. That animal's probably going to eat like 3 to 4 tons. So that is 6,000 to 8,000 pounds of dry forage, dry hay a year. If you have an animal that you're taking out to 30 months grass finished, that animal might eat closer to 6 tons of forage a year. It is not an insignificant amount of hay that these animals need. You can buy small square bales for them. Large round bales works great. And if I had to tell you to make a decision between baleage, which is the wrapped, sweet smelling hay bales, or dry hay, I recommend dry hay, especially if you only have a few animals. This is a question I get asked a lot. So the advantage with dry hay is you can go ahead and feed it over a long period of time. You could drop a bale on Monday and not have to worry about it for a week. If you drop a bale of baleage, or that fermented sweet feed, that bale is going to, once it's open to the air, it's gonna go bad. Quite frankly, it's gonna go bad, and it's not gonna be good for the animals. In the summer, that's about 2 or 3 days. So if the animals that you have can eat that whole bale in 2 to 3 days, fine, you can feed baleage. But if you only have 1 or 2 animals, maybe the bales that you're getting are larger and you can't feed out that amount, I highly recommend dry hay. Now, going back here. So we talk about fencing. If you have beef cattle, you really should have a solid perimeter fence that those animals will not escape from, especially if you're near a road. There is liability associated with animals getting out and getting into the road and getting hit by cars or causing car accidents, and it's not great to deal with that. So having a strong, solid perimeter fence is good. And you can go ahead and subdivide that exterior paddock, that whole area, into multiple little paddocks inside. You can use that for rotational grazing, which is something we could talk about more if you're interested. But we need a solid outer fence. So that can be made of barbed wire, high tensile, or woven wire. You may or may not decide to include a hot wire topper, just so that the cattle have that, not only that physical barrier, but also that mental barrier of, I can't touch that, that's hot. The next 3 slides are specifications for building these 3 different types of fences. I'm not going to go through them in detail. I'm just going to kind of do the highlights. So barbed wire fences are the lowest input fences you can install. Typically, they don't need a whole lot of skill to install, and they use equipment that you have on hand, with the exception of a post pounder or a post hole driller. If you're going to go ahead and put in posts, generally one of the cheaper fences to install. Now, your next step up is a woven wire fence. Woven wire is essentially little squares of wire that run up, about 4 feet is what we use for pasture fence. And it is attached to pounded posts, typically wood, sometimes metal. And this typically takes longer time to install. It's not super hard, but if you're a first timer, we ask that you get your farmer friend to come over and help you with the install, or at least help with the ideation of the install. The cost is going to go up here. So I'm not sure when this presentation was put together. I know it's more than 45 to 95 cents a square or a linear foot. Just because I know the cost of materials has gone up. I think this presentation was put together at least 3 years ago. So the life expectancy is going to be more on this than a barbed wire fence too. And then your final option is a hot wire fence. There are different ways to create hot wire fences, different specifications. If you're interested, I can send you some NRCS diagrams as to how to build these, spacing between the wires, how you run hot and neutral wires so that you make sure, the things that you want to get zapped to stay off the fence. This is mostly a post install with a little bit of wire install. There's high tension involved. It is, it's a moderate cost. It's a little more expensive than barbed wire, not as expensive as woven wire fence. Lifetime's about the same. So another option for you.
So a couple of questions have come up in the chat. And first I'll just say that with the way that prices are right now, USDA FSA office is using $2.50 as a foot for their high tensile fence installation. So that's, you're paying somebody else to do the work, right? So that's part of the bigger cost versus you doing it yourself. And so it's that can sometimes be one of the more expensive startup costs for backyard beef, especially depending on where you live. You want to invest in a really good fence, right? And not have the chance, like Amy was saying, of the cows getting out. Which is why, to Amy's point too, like it's okay to raise them inside if you have that space and that capacity to do that. A couple other questions that have come up. Alejandro is asking about the difference between dry hay and balage. So just to kind of summarize what Amy was saying, like dry hay, and this is in the chat too, but dry hay is kind of traditional hay that's cut, dried. So you'll see equipment out there called tedders, like fluffing it up and drying it out, and then it's baled. That dry hay is preserved at that point. So it'll stay like that as long as it is kept dry, regardless of how long it's exposed to the air and exposed to the environment. So like Amy was saying, if you just have a couple animals, dry hay is the way to go because it's not going to go bad sitting there while the cows are eating it. The other thing that Amy was talking about is called balage. Balage is fermented grass. So grass is cut, it's allowed to dry for a little bit, and then it's harvested, baled up, and wrapped in plastic. And it creates an anaerobic environment. The grass continues to get digested, right? So the bacteria that are naturally occurring in grass is digesting that hay out, and it makes it not more palatable. What's the word I'm looking for? Improves the digestibility.
Yeah. And it's more palatable too.
Yeah, that's very true. So balage is great for finishing cows because it's got higher energy, high quality balage, higher energy, more palatable, right? It's going to have more energy for those cows, but it goes bad as soon as it's exposed to air. So if you don't have enough cows to eat that down, it's not going to be worth it, and you can potentially make cows sick. So for backyard beef, dry hay is definitely the way to go. Alejandro was also asking about how to run hot wire. The best thing to do is to purchase a electric fence. So basically, and Amy, please add too.
Yep, sure.
Basically, you're going to purchase an electric fencer, and it'll say on it, what distance it's good for. Fence systems that are more powerful, have more power running through them, are going to be for longer systems. We have always used the rule of thumb of buy the system that covers twice as much as you actually need it to. So it's a little bit hotter for our bigger cows. All you have to do, the easiest way to do it is you have a power source, you plug it in, and then you're going to run the wire from the electric fence box to your fence, and you use metal wire on the fence. So it's at that point that fence is hot, so it's electric. When you're putting together the fence, you're going to use non-electrical conducting fasteners to whatever post you use. So if you use like a metal T-post, you're going to buy a plastic fastener so that the electric isn't going to be grounding out through that post. If you go online, and we can get you some resources too, there's lots of setups for fence. I think that for backyard beef, as long as it's sturdy, cheaper is better, right? And you're only going to have a couple cows in it versus having a herd of 100 that you're trying to keep in. I've even seen fences made out of pallets, right? So there's a guy out by me that has fence posts, and they got free pallets and put those, and that's how they keep their cows in, and it works really well. So there's definitely some ingenuity there, but we'll find some more resources for fencing. Amy, anything to add after that very long rant.
Yeah, no, that was great. The only thing I want to add is that when you're looking at energizers, they have joules and then like linear feet that it'll charge. Look at the joules. The higher the joules output, the stronger that fencer is. They're typically not super spendy, even if you go between like a 2 joule and an 8 joule. So just go with the higher one. Higher ones are also good because if you have grass that grows up over your fence line, it'll zap it back. To an extent, you do have to keep underneath the lines trimmed or it's going to ground out and it's not going to be that effective mental barrier for the animals. But yeah, Katelyn, I think you covered it. Okay, so we're going to do this small section and then we're going to take like a 2-minute stretch break. So beef cattle health. And this is not fully all-encompassing. This is just to give you an idea of some of the issues that can arise in small-scale beef cattle production. First is respiratory disease. A lot of respiratory diseases are underlying conditions that are exacerbated by stress. So the cattle, if they're healthy and not stressed, may be exposed to this bacteria in their environment and they may not get sick. But if they go through something stressful, like if they're weaned, when they're weaned, I should say, depending on the weaning scenario, that may or may not be very, very stressful for the animal. We see a lot of respiratory diseases where farmers who are growing calves to sell will grow calves, and then the first time that calf leaves its mother is when it goes on a truck to an auction barn. So that calf is going through all sorts of stressors. That calf has a really high susceptibility to falling victim to disease. A lot of respiratory diseases look the same. There are vaccinations for many of the respiratory diseases. Again, why it's a good idea to talk to a farmer that you know, or bring a farmer with you to talk to a farmer you don't know about what kind of vaccination schedule they have for their animals. Animals that are less than a week old and sent to the sale barn or transferred to you are going to go through the same difficulty. Young ones don't have a hugely developed immune system, and so when you put them through those stresses, they end up with things like scours or respiratory disease. So sometimes these don't pop up until a week or so after the cows are brought home. These are really bad in that not only do they put the animal's life at risk, typically it's not a huge risk, but it's still there, they're sick. That animal also goes off feed, and that's going to be more of a risk than them just being sick. Cattle always need to be eating something. Going off feed puts them at risks for other issues, metabolic and physical issues that you just don't want to deal with. So if a cow comes up with a respiratory disease, go ahead and call your veterinarian and get that handled. Some of the symptoms include coughing and sneezing, nasal discharge. Like this animal's been sick for a while. She's also a dairy animal, so she's on the skinny side anyway. But you can see she's not in milk. She might be a first-time heifer, or she may just be an animal that has been sick for so long she's gone out of milk. You can see that there's respiratory, salivary secretions. It's hard to tell what's coming out of her face, but there's stuff coming out of her face that should not necessarily be there. And she just looks unthrifty in general. In terms of recovery period, once you identify what the disease is and treat it with your veterinarian, it'll likely be a couple of weeks before that animal starts to gain again. And it's likely during the disease period that the animal's going to lose weight. If they don't totally go off feed, they're going to eat less feed. So that's going to impact your rates of gain a little bit. One little plug I want to put in here that I did not create in a separate slide, but I think is really important to mention is as of I can't remember if it's June 15th or June 1st, all medically significant over-the-counter antibiotics will no longer be available to farmers, flat out. You'll need to have a veterinarian that you have developed a relationship with to get those antibiotics to treat your animals. So just to let you know, it's coming down the pike. You won't be able to get penicillin, you won't be able to get terramycin, no. So just so that you know, find that veterinarian now and develop that relationship so that if something happens, you can go ahead and get the treatments that you need. All right, diarrheal diseases. There's a bunch of them, but these are two of the most common that you'll probably come across if you come across them. The first is scours. Scours typically occurs in calves, and it's basically a broad definition for calf diarrhea. Calves that have this, it's usually a funny color, it smells pretty bad, and it's just moving through the animal. The nutrients are just moving through that animal system. These animals need to continue to drink. They usually need supportive electrolytes to get better and get over the worst of it. And a veterinarian may have to prescribe an antibiotic for that animal if the disease is bacterial and not viral. The second one, the upper right picture is I think she's a Guernsey. She looks pretty bad. She's suffering from a disease called Johne's disease. This is prevalent in Western New York. I don't know how prevalent, but I do know farms that have it. It's a wasting disease of cattle. Essentially, they get this, it's called a prion disease. It goes into their brain and spinal cord and does some fun stuff. And it causes them to lose weight, go off feed, and there's no cure for it. So you want to make sure that you're purchasing animals from Johne's free farms if you have that option. And I see Katelyn unvideoed, so.
I was just gonna say, unfortunately, Johne's is extremely, sorry, now, okay. Unfortunately, Johne's is extremely prevalent. It's not just in our region, it's across the whole country, and we don't have a good handle on it. On spot herds that we've tested, it's been upwards of 50%, depending on the herd. If you're raising backyard beef, you're going to end up slaughtering those cows before the physical effects of Johne's will affect their rate of gain, their growth. Typically, the first system that it affects is the reproductive system. So you're buying terminal animals. So it's not as huge of a deal for backyard beef producers, but if you're considering moving into breeding your own animals, you don't want to bring that disease on your farm ever. So require history of Johne's testing. You can require that animal's tested for Johne's before you purchase it, and do as much as you can to try to keep it off of your farm in the first place if you ever think you're going to grow to having breeding stock on your farm. But unfortunately, it's everywhere. So it's kind of a catch-22. You end up having to manage it sometimes versus eradicating it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Katelyn. I didn't realize it was that prevalent. I knew it was around, but I guess only some farms know they have it, in part because of them slaughtering animals so early relative. All right. So another external parasite that I want to share, because it has zoonotic potential, so it can spread to humans, is ringworm. We do see ringworm infections quite frequently. It is a fungal disease of the skin. The fungus basically grows under the skin and results in dry, patchy areas on the animal. It's spread by direct contact. So if you touch an animal that looks like this poor little heifer or steer in this image, you may end up with a skin lesion like the one on the right, and you will need to be provided antifungals by your doctor in order to get rid of it. If you see animals that look like this, just don't purchase them. There are ways to manage around it. There are ways to treat it, but I don't think it's necessarily worth it. You may see lice on your cattle, and lice aren't typically a huge concern unless there's a lot of them, like more than 10 lice per inch. Typically, these don't cause issues in the summer months because the sunlight does kill some of the nits and the eggs. But in the wintertime, when the animals are fully indoors, that is going to provide an opportunity for those bugs to really explode in populations. They are species specific, so you don't need to worry about bringing them home, and they require living on the animals full time. So just say you have one animal that you're finishing out at a time, it's got a lice infestation. You go ahead and send it to slaughter, you wait a couple weeks and you bring a new animal in. That environment's going to essentially be freed of lice because they require a blood host to live. So as long as you have no other cattle on your premise, you should then have broken the cycle. Alternatively, you can go ahead and treat these animals. If you need information on that, let me know. There's also a link in this slide. Treatment options are also listed there. Flies are something that we all deal with as cattle producers. There are horn flies, which affect the body of the animal, so the flanks, sides, the upper legs, and then there are face flies, which affect the face. It's kind of a flip-floppy thing. You saw me, mentioning towards my face with horn flies, but horn flies are body, face flies are face. Face flies can actually bite the eyes by accident and start pink eye infections. They carry the bacteria that causes pink eye infections. So if they're at a really high number, it's a good idea to apply an insecticide to help reduce those. They're more of an annoyance than anything unless they start causing issues. The number of flies on this particular cow, just looking at it now, we want to start treating at about 100 flies per side of the body. This looks like she's a little high. This is from a study that I did this summer. I would go ahead and treat that animal, but that's, my professional opinion. But again, if you're not sure, reach out to a veterinarian or a farm friend to get some advice on that and what product to use. Because I talked about pink eye, I want to show you what pink eye looks like. Pink eye shows itself as like a cloudiness to the eye, and in very severe infections can actually cause total blindness, where the infection just runs behind the cornea and the animal can't see. There's not really production loss from pink eye. It's just very uncomfortable for the animal. So getting that treated is usually by eye injections of antibiotics is helpful just for the comfort of that animal. But it's not going to result in production losses unless your animal is blind and can't find food. More information about pink eye is at that link there. And just overall, this is something that Katelyn and I have been sharing throughout this conversation is biosecurity. And we picked bits and pieces of what biosecurity is. Biosecurity is the key to success, and that is keeping your animals separate from other animals, buying in animals that have a good disease-free status prior to getting on your farm. Buying stock from people you know or reputable farms is a good place to start. Keeping new animals, so just say you have a beefer that's ready to go out and you're bringing another one in, or you're raising two at the same time from two different places. You'll want to keep those animals completely separate from each other for 2 to 4 weeks in order for them to get acclimated to what's on your farm in terms of diseases and help them overcome any of the shipping stress associated with moving onto your farm. Don't let people visit your cattle just because they can spread stuff around. This is especially true if they have cattle at home. And a good rule of thumb is to keep a pair of farm boots that only you wear or your family. I mean, like if you and your wife have similar size feet, or you and your son, or you and your daughter, you can go ahead and share boots because it's going to your farm. But don't share them with, don't wear those boots off the farm to farm supply stores or areas where other farmers are, or other people that keep beef are. It's just a good way to help raise a barrier between your cattle and everybody else. All right, let's take a 2-minute break. We have a lot to cover still, so let's just take 2 minutes. Let's come back at 6:54. Stretch, bio break, whatever you need. We'll come back, answer questions, and then move on to the next section. Welcome back, everybody. Any questions that you have, please pop them in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen. Okay. Any questions pop in while we were gone?
None that we've seen so far. So we will charge ahead.
There you go.
I'm so sorry. None that we've seen so far. So we can charge ahead.
Super duper. Okay. So let's talk about food. We did talk about baleage versus hay, which is really good because that's the majority of the cattle diet. Now, the exact type of feed you feed, it's going to depend. It's going to depend on age, what you have available in your area for forages and concentrates, and what your finishing goals are. Depending on what you feed an animal, it's going to grow at a different rate. So, for example, if you feed grass-fed animals, so grass all the way through the end of their life, they're going to gain like 1 to 1.5 pounds a day on average, looking over the course of the year. If you're feeding an animal that is on a silage diet, most of us probably aren't going to do silage, but let's say we're going to feed hay and cob corn, it's going to be somewhere closer to 2.5 pounds a day. If you're exceptional and that cow is like super pampered and not stressed, they may get 3 pounds a day on average. So it's going to all depend. Let's talk about age and feed needs for a green calf or a started calf. So calves are going to need milk or a quality milk replacer, not milk substitute or a milk supplement, but a milk replacer for the first 6 weeks of age, simply because their bodies are not developed to eat even grain at this age. They can eat a little bit to start to develop their rumen or their main stomach that ferments forage later on in their life, but they really need milk for that first start. You always need to offer water, even with milk feedings. These animals are going to start to wean themselves, and you want to have water available for that, and because they're going to get thirsty during the day in between feedings, especially during hot weather. So go ahead and always offer water. Calf starter, which is, you can buy that from your local mill or your local farm supply store, around 22 to 25% protein can be offered to these calves in addition to milk after the first 7 days. And then once those animals consistently consume about 3 pounds of calf starter for 3 consecutive days, I'd go a little more because that's who I am as a person. But once they're consuming that amount, you can go ahead and wean them onto a hay and calf grower type diet. This article by APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is going to have information on guides to feeding little calves like this. This is a really cool chart that I found that just illustrates the amount of water that animals need. In addition, I think this is in addition to milk or milk replacer. So even a 1-week-old calf is going to need 1.3 to 2 gallons a day of water in their diet. When they hit 4 weeks of age, that's going to up to 3 to 3.5 gallons of water a day. It's not insignificant. Dairy cattle drink about a bathtub of water a day. I guess beef cattle, if I had to extrapolate, would consume probably a good third to a half of that. So they just need a lot of water to run that big 40-gallon fermentation vat that is their rumen inside of their body. So always make sure water is available. For weaned calves that are younger than 9 weeks, some of these calves will come, you can buy them younger than 9 weeks when they're not fully weaned off onto calf starter. Some of them are on calf starter or a creep feed. Some of them, if they're just weaned, need a little boost, maybe through some sort of supplementation like vitamins, minerals, electrolytes, that sort of thing, maybe a little bit of calf starter. And so for these young calves, you'll want to supply quality forage. That's hay with about 11% protein and about 55 to 60 TDN. TDN is one of those acronyms that basically just means energy. This is a measure of energy that the animal can use. And so around 55 to 60 is good. This is typical of an average quality dry hay. This doesn't need to be alfalfa hay. This doesn't need to be orchard grass hay. This doesn't need to be second cutting hay, but it needs to be quality first cutting hay or moderate quality second cutting hay. That's what these animals need to thrive. They don't need the rocket fuel that the dairy cattle need. Even if they're a dairy type calf that you're growing out, they still don't need the rocket fuel. So when you supply calf grower or grain to these calves, you can start with a very small amount and then get them up in the amount that they're eating by feeding them a little bit more every day. All right, so feeding weaned calves is a general rule. Now we're jumping to those animals that are bucket fed and then at 9 weeks they're weaned, or those animals that have been weaned off their mom. So these animals will eat between 3 and 3.5% of their body weight in dry matter. That's a lot. So I'm gonna break this down. So dry matter is essentially what we measure feed value on. So like those numbers, the 11.5% protein and 50 to 60 TDN, that's based on dry matter. So hay is 90% dry matter, 10% moisture. So that means that if we're feeding, for instance, a 500-pound calf at a rate of 3% of its body weight a day, it's going to need about 17 pounds of hay a day, or a mixture of hay and grain. Beef cattle, though, cannot eat straight grain. So it's a little bit of a misconception that in the commercial industry that they're fed solid grain. They're not. They're typically fed a high energy silage ration with additional concentrates like corn and soybeans mixed in, but you can't feed them total grain. They're going to just keel over and their legs are going to stick up in the air. They can't function on that. They need the fiber to make their rumen go, and they can extract a lot of nutrition from that. They need, if you're going to ramp them up to a really high energy diet, which you can do in the finishing phase. So once they've hit like 900 pounds or so, they're going to need at least 15% of the weight of their diet in fibrous forage, hay, essentially. When you're feeding them from 275 to 750 pounds, this is typically the weight that you'll buy for a feeder, a typical beef feeder. So a feeder is going to be an animal that's been left on mom, typically, not always, but an animal left on mom until it's hit a certain age and then weaned off, and then that animal is called a feeder calf. And these rations that you're feeding them, the feed that you're feeding them, should be highly palatable, so something that they're going to want to eat, and have a high nutritional value, just because, especially when you're buying calves in, there's going to be a little bit of setback in terms of weaning stress if they're being weaned right before you get them, or there's going to be a little setback in stress just because of moving to a new environment, meeting new people, meeting new facilities. So in terms of that, vitamins, minerals, that can be helpful for that transition. And when thinking about feeding them, about 60% of their ration can be concentrates. What are concentrates? Corn silage, which most of us don't have access to, whole corn or cracked corn, soybeans. Most of people who are producing backyard beef use a corn and corn soybean mix. And this can be fed starting at about a pound or two a day, and then adding in a quarter to a half pound every day or two, until the animal no longer, you can notice that it's no longer accepting that feed, that additional concentrate. Hay is always going to be provided free choice when you're doing this. And 60% is just a guideline, but what you can do is you could start that 1 to 2 pounds a day, increase it a little bit, see how that animal reacts. Is the poop still solid or relatively solid? Is that animal still eating its full ration every day? If the answer is yes, then maybe you can bump it a little bit more. But if that animal starts to regress or goes off feed, which we don't want to happen, it'll set them back a couple of weeks, then that's it. They can't get any more. That's their physiological limit. Information about feeding cattle with concentrates like that can be found at this link below. I think it's a really good read, and it provides you step-by-step instructions for what I just gave a 30,000-foot overview for. We talked about this, so I'm going to go ahead and skip it just because it's redundant. Okay, so I'm just looking to see if there's any questions in the chat box, and then we're going to switch gears and talk about timelines and processing, which is going to be the final part of this discussion. Gonna give it 5 seconds. Okay, so moving forward, how long from calf to steak? The question everybody wants to know. But before we do that, I want you to go ahead and type your favorite cut of beef into the chat box. It could be any cut you want. That includes ground and snack sticks, shaved beef, Delmonico steaks. So go ahead and put that in the chat. My favorite is chuck roast. I know it's a bottom end cut, but man, it's flavorful, and I love pot roast. It's like my favorite thing. I'm also a sucker for potatoes, so that's probably it. Okay. All right, so we've got some fillets and sirloins. Oh, you guys like eating high on the cow here. All kinds of steaks, some chuck roast. Okay, ground beef. This is great. A good diversity of different cuts. Okay. The good news is backyard beef produces really cheap steaks and really expensive ground beef, so it all evens out in the end. And it's homegrown, so like that just adds a dollar value right on top. But thank you for that. Okay, so finishing timelines. Beef type animals, so Charolais, Angus, Brangus, Limousin, those animals are going to finish in about 14 to 18 months. And 140 to 200 of those days are going to be spent on a grain type ration. Grain type with the forage mixed in that we just talked about. Holstein, so straight up dairy animals, are going to take a little bit longer, about 16 to 20 months to finish, because they're a bigger framed animal. They've got more fleshing to do. They're going to spend 265 days on a finishing ration. So about 2 months more, maybe 4 months more. So just more time on that end ration before they're at weight and at finish to go to the processor. Generally, and we talked about this, animals fed concentrates can gain 2.5 to 3 pounds a day, and grass fed's closer to 1.25 to 1.5. I have seen beef cattle gains on grass fed lower than that. So just be conscientious of the quality of feed that you're buying to make sure you don't need to feed rocket fuel, but also you don't need to feed mulch hay. it's a happy medium is good. And they should grow okay for you. Always anticipate that if you are finishing an animal so finishing is like 950 pounds until they go to slaughter, whether that be 1,200 pounds or 1,400 pounds. Those animals are going to gain a lot less in the winter than they are under ideal conditions in the spring, summer, or fall. So anticipate that if you're finishing over the winter, a good rule of thumb is to double the amount of time that you think it takes to finish those animals, because they're going to be using a lot of that energy just to keep warm, and that doesn't go to muscle and fat deposition. This is an amazing video that we just don't have time to play, but Dr. Mike Baker went to a 4-H show and essentially describes exactly how to determine when your animal is finished and ready to go to slaughter. This animal is pretty much ready to go. Very fleshy animal. There's still a little bit of fat deposition that can happen, but the animal in this screenshot is pretty well good to go. Just a very high overview of what you're looking for. You're looking for good muscling over those bones, no bones sticking out, about a 1/2 inch of back fat, so you can poke your fingers up against the spine and wiggle them around and approximate how much back fat's there. We want to target about a 1/2 inch. The brisket, or the belly, the front part of the cow, that's going to hang low and feel like a cantaloupe. They're going to have fat where their tail meets their body, and their flank, which is where the back leg attaches to the back of the belly, is going to be nice and low hanging. It's not going to be high and tight against the body. That indicates that there is enough fatty tissue in that animal that it's depositing fat within the muscle as well as outside of the muscle. And we want inside the muscle so that we have juiciness, tenderness, and flavor. So what kinds of yields should you expect? Now, once the animal is slaughtered, you're going to lose a fraction of that animal, obviously, feet, hide, head, guts. You're going to lose that. So for beef cattle, you're going to have left over, hanging carcass is about 63% of live weight. Dairy type animals are going to be lower, about 5%, 3 to 5% lower. And if you have a dairy beef cross, it's going to be somewhere in the middle, depending on what those genetics are. So when we think about muscling and fat deposition, I'm going to just relate it back to genetics really quick, because we may be expecting something out of our beef cows and we might get something different based on what their genetics are. And that's okay. All beef is delicious. All beef is amazing if it's homegrown, but we do want to consider how it looks. So in this image are two different steers, and in the top picture on the left, you see a ribeye steak. This is cut between 12th and 13th rib for those of you who are curious. But this ribeye steak, you can see how it's elongated and there's a really big fat cap on it. That's because this animal has more dairy type genetics in it. Both of these cows, I think they're both steers. Yeah, both of these steers are beef on dairy crosses. So the one up at top actually has more dairy genetics in it, which is why the ribeye is long. And then the animal that's down lower has a fatter, more beef Angus type, quality grade A beef type ribeye. So that just shows you the difference that can occur between animals. And like I said, difference is okay. An animal with more fat on it, like you can see just how thick that fat cap is on that ribeye in the top picture. That animal is going to lose a little bit more between it being a hot carcass and it being cut into cuts versus the animal on the bottom, because there's less fat to cut away from that animal on the bottom. It didn't deposit as much fat. So just something to consider. So overfeeding our animals and making them fat just to get better interior quality is not necessarily the goal. So feeding to prime shouldn't be your goal. Feeding to a good finished animal with good fleshing and good fat cover, yeah, that's a pretty good goal. So I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about getting your cattle processed. But before I do that, I want to ask if you know how you'll get your animals processed. Are you going to use a USDA facility, custom exempt facility? Are you going to process them on your home property with the help of a neighbor maybe, or experienced butcher? Or do you not know and you want to learn more? I did not put this as a poll question.
That's what I was.
So could you please type it in the chat?
Good.
Thanks, Katelyn. See, I didn't put a number after my poll question. That's why I didn't put it. Okay. So we have facility custom exempt, or USDA. Not sure. Okay. Unknown. Yep. All right. So it sounds like this will be good to go through real quick. So USDA is the highest level of inspection that you can achieve and will process your cattle into individual cuts that are marked for resale. You can choose to use them yourself or sell them, and that is okay. You can sell them as individual cuts, individual packs of Hamburg, etc. You can sell them over state lines. You can sell them to friends. You can sell them to people you don't know. That is USDA. It's typically more expensive to get your animals processed because you pay a price per pound and then a price to pack them, and USDA approved packaging, and that incurs an additional fee. The wait lists to get into USDA processing facilities is typically longer than those for custom exempt facilities. Custom exempt gives you less freedom in terms of how you can sell your meat, but they're easier to get into typically, and they're a little cheaper. So in addition to being a little easier to get into and a little cheaper, custom exempt is where you take your animal to be processed, you get it back, use it for home use. Or if you're selling it, and you might sell half of your beef, you can go ahead, sell that half of beef in advance to somebody for whatever price you want to charge for the hanging weight. And then you take that animal, as a farmer, you take that animal to the butcher as a service. And then you can go ahead when the animal comes back, you then sell the pre-sold half, you then give the pre-sold half to your customer. That is custom exempt. You cannot sell individual packages of meat, and those packages are actually stamped, not for sale. And that's because they don't undergo the rigorous USDA inspection and testing required to maintain the facilities and inspect all the animals that come in, including yours. So custom exempt is absolutely fine. You just have more restrictions as to how you can sell your meat if you're intending to sell it. You can slaughter your animals on farm, and there are some who do this. And this is super cool, super fine, relieves you from having to go to a processor, but you do have to have the knowledge of processing a beef or be willing to totally botch a butcher. If you happen to botch a butcher, you could get it on your first time. I'm not here to judge. But anyway, you can process at your own home farm, but you cannot sell the meat. And that's because there's no regulatory oversight in the states like, and the US is like, can't do that. But you can use it for home use. You can give it to friends and family, that sort of thing. Now let's spend 2 seconds and now a little longer and talk about expectations. So what are you gonna get? So we talked about 63% of the animal's live weight being your hot carcass weight for a beef type animal, and about 3 to 5% less for a dairy type animal, and somewhere in the middle for the crosses. If you decide to dry age that animal is going to lose water weight. That's just how dry aging works. And as you dry age that animal, there's also going to be more waste and trim that you should expect. So you'll typically get less weight off that animal after it shrinks a little bit in cold storage. So you can expect to take home about 38 to 42% of your live weight. It's pretty cool. So a little bit over half of the hot carcass weight. Obviously, if you get bone-in cuts, you're going to take home more weight than if you take bone-out cuts home. The butcher's going to charge you based on the hanging weight of the animal in terms of price per pound. So you can choose how you get your cuts cut. If you get them boneless, they're going to be theoretically more expensive per cut. If you get them bone in, they'll be technically a little bit cheaper per cut, but you're still paying the same amount regardless. It's just the amount of meat that you get. So using 1,100 pound steer as an example, just say that it had a 61% hot carcass weight. We'll say it was a beef dairy cross. That's going to be about 671 pounds hanging weight. The bone out take home is going to be about 418 pounds of meat total for that whole animal. And bone in take home is going to be about 50 pounds more, so at 473. So that's just the crude calculation. There may be some differences based on your animal, how full that animal was when it walked into the, physically full, like how much did it eat before it walked into the butcher. And then how fatty it was. If it was really fatty, obviously your take home is going to be a little less. If you decide to keep offal, so like tongue, heart, liver, oxtail, that sort of thing, cheeks, whatever, you're going to end up taking more meat home as well. In terms of yield, here's what you can expect to take home from a half a cow. I am not going to make an assumption that everybody's going to do, half cows or whole cows. So we're just going to use half as a general rule. So from a 1,000 pound to a 1,200 pound live animal, you can expect this list of cuts. So 14 T-bones, 2 sirloin tips, 8 packages of stew beef, 80 to 100 pounds of ground beef, which is awesome because it's highly utilizable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And with processors, there's always the option of having more ground beef or more stew meat. Some people say cut the steaks out and just give me the rest ground, and that's okay. That's great. If you are a ground family, that's the way for you. So there are options there. You don't need to get it cut like this. Okay, and now is the real poll question number 3, Katelyn, if you want to go ahead and throw it up. So we're done for the lecture portion of today's conversation. So just checking in, I want to see how you're feeling after today's class. Are you feeling more confident? Ready to go? Do you still have some questions? Did you learn some stuff, but you still have some questions? Or I didn't learn anything, and that's okay too. Your second question, if you scroll down a little bit, is beef cattle raising for you or not? Or maybe. And do you want to learn more about beef cattle? And if you do, we'd really like you to pop what you want to know in the chat, because that's going to help us make programs that are tailored to what you're interested in. Okay, so it looks like most of us are pretty confident about raising beef, but still need some more resources, which is good, raising beef is for some of us, maybe not for all of us. And all of you want to learn more. And this is awesome. So thank you very much for sharing that feedback. And this is the question that I just posed to you. What topics do you want to learn more about in terms of beef cattle production and management? This can include pasture management, this can include disease, meat processing, sales, what have you. Go ahead and pop that in the chat. And as you're going through that and thinking about that, we would like your help. So we want to create programming that means the most to you. So Katelyn is going to go ahead and pop a survey into the chat box. That survey is also going to come up automatically after you close out of Zoom, and we're going to send it via email. So you're going to see it a couple of different times. And this survey will help us understand what we did well, what we didn't do well, what you'd like to see that you didn't see, what you liked that you saw, and will help us develop programming to match your needs. Yeah.
Oh, hold on. Do you want to return back to the questions from the beginning of the?
Yep, let's go ahead and do that. I'm gonna go ahead and put a cute cow up.
Perfect. So one of the questions that came up first was what we're keeping our cows with goats for now. Is that an issue? I'll let Amy talk too, but just so all of you know, I have a diversified livestock farm, which means that we started out as beef farmers and I kept bringing home other things. And one of those other things was goats. And we do co-graze our beef cows and goats. So both from like the research side of things, the herd health side of things, and then just the actual management, it is okay to graze cows and goats together. There's a couple of like asterisks after that statement, right? So the first one is that goats require different fencing than cows do. And by that, I mean cows are okay with a single hot wire and goats need an 8-foot concrete wall to stay in. So
she's not wrong.
No. So if you are trying to fence in large acreage for all of your cows, it can be really cost prohibitive to make it also goat proof too. So you might look at just having the goats included in one small area. The other more important concern is on internal parasite load. So there's worms, right? So we always talk about deworming cows, deworming animals. Internal parasites are a concern because they reduce the productivity of that animal. So they're not able to take the feed that you're paying to feed them and turn it into meat. With cattle, they have like a higher capacity to take on internal parasites, right? So they will have to take on more worms before you start to notice it affecting their weight that they're putting on, their coat health, and just their general well-being. With goats, particularly if you're raising meat goats with them, they're extremely susceptible to internal parasites. So you have to, they're going to show signs of worm load a lot faster than the cows will, and it can be really tough to try to like reverse that. If you're grazing the cows and the goats together, you're making sure that the grass isn't getting too low, right? So 3 inches, I think, is like the general rule of thumb, right, Amy? Mm-hmm. Then you can avoid that, right? So as long as everybody's happy, there's lots of room, there's lots of food to be shared, there's no problem putting goats and cows together. The bigger concerns are if you're grazing that pasture down too far, or if you're using like a sacrifice lot, those goats are going to be way more susceptible to internal parasites than the cows, and they do share internal parasites. So that's kind of the only, like the big concern, right?
I got a bigger concern. And that is minerals.
Mm.
So unless you said it and like it totally went whoop whoop.
Nope.
But goats, well, it's more of an issue with like sheep and cattle. Yeah. But you should be conscientious of what minerals you're providing for these animals, and keep their minerals separate if you can, and also keep goat supplemental feed away from cows. Yeah. Especially if you're like graining somebody differently than somebody else, they might end up just getting way too much.
Yep, absolutely. So hopefully that answered, I think that was Allison's question. So tell us if that wasn't a good answer. For the next question that came up, which Amy did touch on, was which breed is best to raise. So I think like if you want the 30,000 foot summary, is it really doesn't matter, right? So we definitely recommend though for like backyard growers to start out with a more compact, docile breed. So something like a Hereford, right? Or even an Angus. I know everybody wants Angus because that's kind of the standard that we've set in America, right? But they can sometimes be a little bit angry too.
A little crazy.
So I think, you know, it's more important though to visit the farm where those cows are coming from. And while you're there, get a sense for like, what's the personality of the cows, right? Like how docile are they? How comfortable are they with people? Smaller animals, something like a Galloway. What are some other small?
Dexters are really small. Devons are on the small side.
Yep. They're going to be much easier to start because you just need less infrastructure, right? If you start out with a Simmental, which are like, they're big, they're really big, they're going to scare you. So start out with something that's small and cute, and it'll be a little bit easier for you to get started with. Another question was anything to give me courage to do this. So I don't think we can officially recommend alcohol, and it's not great business management planning to start there. But I think that what we've kind of focused on for this seminar is backyard beef, right? So start small. I think, like Amy was saying, purchase a calf that's already on the ground, purchase a weaned calf. So you're not even dealing with trying to feed it milk, and you only have to have it for a year, right? If you're purchasing a weaned calf. So start small. Amy, anything to add for courage to bite, do it?
Yeah, I would say it's hard because cattle are big and they're a commitment and they can be really scary. And if you don't feel like you're ready, I'm not recommending you jump in with 2 feet. I would say gather more information. And then once you're like, I'm pretty sure I can do this, then go ahead and start. It'd be really unfortunate if you jumped into this and you truly weren't ready. So I'm giving you space and I'm giving you permission to say, it's okay. You don't have to do it right now.
Absolutely. And I think like building your network too, right? So
Yes,
have
100%.
some farmer friends that already have experience with beef, hang out with them, see how they're doing chores, talk to them, pick their brain, right? Give yourself time to build that community in your own
That's
skills.
excellent. Yeah. It's also a way to get into things that you don't want to, like goats.
Yes, accurate. So another question, I need to know how things are performed now, as I've not been able to work beef in 40 years. I would say, you know, the cool thing about cows is that they're still cows. So
They're pretty much the same.
Yeah. And I think, you know, there are some changes with like breed selection. There's changes with processing requirements, particularly if you want to sell them, and regulations, but cows are still cows and they eat the same thing. And
there hasn't been enough change in the genetics to actually change your feeding program either.
Right.
So as you know, this presentation discussed general feeding programs because they work for all the cows. So I think you're good to go.
Then wanting to learn more about herd health. And Amy definitely touched base on the ones that pop up the most for smaller scale backyard growers. I'll say too that in general, like if you only have 1 or 2 steers that you're raising for a short period of time, you're feeding them well, they're vaccinated, you're taking good care of them, like you're not going to have herd health issues for the most part because there's low pressure and they're all healthy. When we run into things like not having adequate housing or windbreaks, not having high quality hay, right? Like that's where cows are going to be more stressed out, and it's going to be harder for them to fight off commonly occurring bacteria that's just in the ground, right? And also if you're purchasing animals from an unknown source. So if you're purchasing from the auction barn, you have no idea what vaccinations that cow got. You have no idea if they're bringing home anything with them. So I think that the best way to manage herd health is to be super proactive, have a vaccination schedule, know where you're buying your cows from, and just keep them happy and healthy beforehand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as backyard beef producers, don't even worry about giving them vaccines. Just make sure the farm that you're getting them off of has a solid vaccine plan. If they're giving them like 1 vaccine a year, you know, that's better than no vaccines a year, but a couple of vaccines a year, and the farm knows exactly what they're for and can tell that to you, that's probably going to be a good bet.
And I saw a comment too about like connecting with a vet, I'll say that it is really tough for small growers to find vets depending on your area. I would encourage you to reach out to neighbors that you have that are also raising beef cattle. Because sometimes if you are trying to get on a vet schedule and they're like, oh, I'm not accepting new customers. If you say like, oh, well, I'm right down the road from so-and-so, then you can sometimes get that vet to visit you on the same day they're visiting the other farm. The other thing too is that on a small scale, if you just have the vet come once a year to do like an annual herd check or vaccination if you need it, that's enough of a relationship that then they can help you diagnose and treat over the phone. They can help prescribe you anything that you might need, like if you needed an antibiotic, as long as you've got an existing relationship with them. So it's not necessarily like you need a vet out every single week. It can just be once a year, and it's just that relationship with them. So definitely reach out to your neighbors and see who they're using and make some phone calls.
Yep.
Okay, what other questions? So Nina was sharing about the July I can't ever pronounce
extravaganza.
Yes.
It's a good program.
It's really good. It's excellent. Speakers are top notch. And FarmOps offers scholarships to attend for veterans. So reach out, or you can check out the FarmOps scholarship page or reach out to Nina directly and she will help connect you with that. Allison's encouraging everybody to visit friends farms that also have cattle. I think again, like that's build your community and see how other people are doing it is a really great way to build your courage and rip the Band-Aid off, right? What type of pastures should be grown for beef? Amy, you wanna?
I love this question because I have the best answer. It depends.
Yes.
Beef. So the reality is beef cattle can do absolutely fine in a native grass pasture so long that it's managed such that there's enough forage for them. Beef cattle do great in a single species pasture should it be managed adequately. Beef cattle do fine in an annual type pasture where you're planting something like triticale or sorghum Sudan grass or turnips. And they do okay. So what I would recommend is if you are very unsure, reach out to your local extension agent. That may be us if you're in Southwest New York, and we can take a look at what you have on your property and give you suggestions for what you could plant to help you reach your goals. So generally, if you're worried about plant toxicity, cattle are not going to eat what's toxic unless they're forced to. So if you're unsure of what your pasture quality is, also offer some free range, like free access hay. And those animals can eat the hay if they're hungry, eat the pasture if it's available, and everybody stays happy and healthy.
Yeah, I would add too that if you like just recently purchased a property and you've got idle fields, so fields that you don't really know what's growing or it hasn't been harvested in a few years, cows are amazing. Like they will demolish that and natural grasses will pop up and it'll be the healthiest pasture you've seen 5 years from now. So, and like Amy said, as long as you're offering a supplemental hay, so they can get access to something that's, safer for them. They're not going to eat the bad stuff. So you can put them out into idle pastures as long as you're making sure that it's safe for them to be on it. And they're going to browse around, they're going to knock down the stuff that they don't want to eat anyway. And like walking on that pasture, you've got manure on that pasture or that field for fertilizer. It really does help rejuvenate idle fields really quickly.
Yeah. And something that I didn't put in the presentation that I absolutely should have gotten its own slide is that beef cattle have to have a mineral supplement, a complete mineral supplement, not just a salt block. Needs to be a beef cattle or cattle mineral block. And that should be offered free choice to those cattle at all times. They may be fine without it, but it's cheap enough that it is good insurance to make sure that your animals grow the way that you want them to grow.
And you don't need anything fancy, just what Tractor Supply sells for $12 a block. Like that's fine.
And I mean, a $12 block will probably last your cow for its life.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, funds or grants to assist with the cost of building a fence. The best way to access these is to call your county soil and water office. Once you're on their list, they do something called AEM. Now I can't remember what that is. Ag Environmental Management Plan, right? Okay.
I think so.
So they'll come out to the farm, they'll do your AEM, and that gets you in their system. So when they have grants available, they know what type of a system you have and where your like areas of concern are. And that's where most of the funding comes from for fencing systems, either the Soil and Water Office or the NRCS office, so the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So each county has their own Soil and Water Office, their own NRCS office. So call them, make sure you're on their list. They'll either come out and do a site visit, or they'll ask you a few questions about like what type of a farm you have. And then as opportunities come up, they'll notify you XYZ is available. Would you like to do this project? I'll tell you too that most of those are cost share. So they are not, we're going to pay 100% for your fencing. So, and it's also, there's no such thing as free money. So sometimes you've got to front the money and then you might get reimbursed back for some of it. Sometimes it's a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 year long waiting period. So I wouldn't assume that you're going to have grants for putting up your fencing system. And then the final thing I'll add, and then I'll let Amy add anything else, is typically they're also for farms that are operating as a business versus a hobby farm or like a backyard beef. So if you just had a couple of steers, it's going to be more difficult for you to find funding for fencing than if you were a like fully commercial size farm operation.
Mm-hmm. And the 2 other things I wanted to add to that is I just want to highlight soil and water conservation, right? Conservation. A lot of these fences are installed to eliminate resource concerns like access to water they shouldn't, erodible surfaces. Maybe it's the transition of a plowed vegetable field to a, permanent pasture. Those kind of resource concerns are what they're focusing on. So if you just want a pasture fence to be paid for on a property, that's probably a big ask. The other thing I want to mention is that in addition to some of the money fronting for these programs, you may also have to do annual reporting, or you may have to pay some of the money or all of the money back. So like when you put your cattle out to pasture, when they're rotating through each pasture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a lot of strings attached for that money. We share it with producers, but it's not easy to get, and it's certainly not no strings attached.
Absolutely. There's no such thing as free money, right?
Nope.
So we had a comment about breed selection, which again, I think that at the end of the day, like my personal humble opinion is that like it doesn't matter, which I know is really sad because that's what people spend a lot of time on. But, and especially for backyard growers, right? Like getting a registered animal that's the perfect shape and checks off all the boxes and would win grand champion at the fair, like it's going to taste the same as your commercial heavy duty crossbreed that like she's just a beaut and she does what she's got to do, right? So I think like don't be afraid of the breed, go visit the farm and see how those animals look. I think that it's more important to think about your source than the breed, and that's like my opinion. So I don't know, Amy, if you have any other suggestions or thoughts about.
No, I don't. You covered it. Yeah.
I think it's fun. We on our farm, we do artificial insemination, so we can purchase semen that's like different breeds than what we have, and we don't have to wait for the bull to grow up and all this stuff. So we're starting to do some fun crossbreeds just because to see what happens, right? So I think it's fun to think about breed selection, but I don't think it's important.
Ditto.
Perfect. So comment just about learning more about meat processing, purchasing, which we can definitely help connect you with and encourage you to include that on your feedback survey, because we have capacity for doing more of these seminars on more deep dive topics. Being able to find a vet that handles large animals, we talked about that for a little bit.
Caitlin, is there a resource list that we can share with them if they're in Western New York? Do we have that together yet, or is that still in the works?
Yes, we do have that available. So, and I can pull that up as well in just a second. So for farms that are located in Western New York, we have a directory of, or Southwestern New York, we have a directory of veterinarians that we can share with you. And if you're not in Southwest New York, just reach out to your local extension office. They might also have a similar thing.
Yep.
Okay, so I think that's all I think we caught up with the questions.
Okay, super.
What I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you the survey link one more time. We're going to hang out here for a few minutes. We'll put some music on in the background. We encourage you to complete that survey right now while you're still thinking about the topic. And then if you have any additional ideas later on, you'll get the survey again. So you can fill it out 2 or 3 times if more things come to mind. So go ahead and click on that. If you have any other questions, you can drop those in the chat. Anything I'm missing, Amy?
I think at this point, why don't we go ahead and stop the recording so that if there's questions that are sensitive, we can have them asked